7:44, good morning to you. Watching and listening to Breakfast with Stephen and Anne.
Yes, and joining us to go through some of the day's headlines, author Ella Whelan and Deputy Editor of Spiked, Fraser Myers. What did I say there? Deputy Editor of Spiked.
Hey, it was just about right.
Was it? Oh, good, I'm glad. Fraser, the COVID inquiry and Boris Johnson's performance.
So Boris Johnson was grilled over 2 days at the COVID inquiry. I mean, I've found a story in the Mail that's talking about more behind the scenes, looking at the lawyers in the inquiry, and they're being paid an absolute fortune.
And there are so many of them.
There are so many. There are hundreds of them. So it's costing around £750,000 a day whenever the inquiry is sitting, and half of the money is going to these lawyers.
Where's the other half going?
I guess on the building, on various things. The judge herself is on over 200 grand a year as well. But Hugo Keith Casey, the lead counsel, who people will have seen grilling Boris Johnson, the Mail have gone to his website and looked at how he describes himself. And he describes himself as a top performer, as having a galaxy-sized brain, very
on his own website.
It's incredibly sort of full of himself. And people will have noticed, if they've been watching, that this inquiry doesn't seem to... obviously it's about the whole pandemic, but it covers almost everything. It seems to cover a lot of the obsessions of the political class. So, Boris Johnson was being grilled on the gender balance of his team, whereas when he tried to raise the question of where did the virus come from, did it maybe come from a lab, he was told to be quiet and told that this is outside of the scope of the inquiry.
It's like all the stuff about his WhatsApp messages, which we've been playing a clip of this morning. And whereas part of me thinks, well, yes, it's a question that needs to be answered, in terms of saying, how do we prepare ourselves for this happening again, who cares what's happened to his WhatsApp messages? That's not going to help us in the future.
Well, especially as we know that a huge amount of the WhatsApp messages was this kind of frivolous sort of nonsense, do you call it banter, do you call it idiot behaviour between him and the ministers and calling people rude names and things like that. It's of no political interest to, if he was still Prime Minister perhaps, but there's no political interest to us, particularly for planning for future pandemics. We keep being told that this is inquiries about making us ready and learning lessons. I just see it as a sort of... It's like a pantomime performance. It really, you have, in the way it's reported in the media, the idea of a blockbuster showdown between Cummings or whoever, or Johnson and whoever. And I think, actually, we have to remember that those years were horrendous. They were not just because people died, but also because people's lives were shattered by successive lockdowns.
Well, that's, you see, where the gender balance does come in quite interestingly, doesn't it? Because I know that in many instances there were criticisms that some of the committees that were sitting were entirely male, and there was no female voice. And I know it doesn't only take a female voice to say, but there was nobody there to say, hang on a minute, what about nurseries and schools? And what about my granny in the care home? And the female perspective was very important, in hindsight, very important, and wasn't voiced fully enough.
Well, I think there are some points where people have said that because of this there were sort of male obsessions, like certain shooting was allowed or in certain periods, and obvious things weren't. Childcare wasn't really thought about, but at the same time, I saw
shooting but no child.
there was, really? But there was also this suggestion when Helen McNamara was on the stand a couple of weeks ago that had there been more women in the top team, fewer women would have died from domestic abuse. And I just think, well, actually, no, that the cause of that was lockdown. You could have as many female perspectives on lockdown that you like.
That perspective still needed to be heard. It wasn't.
It does, but I think probably the worst thing that's coming out of this inquiry is that the narrative is honing down to coming... You can see the conclusion coming that lockdowns didn't happen fast enough or quick enough or weren't severe enough. And there are lots of people who lost loved ones to COVID, and the situation in care homes and all the rest of it is terrible. But I think most people's perspective is that the damage in their lives has been done to an enforced kind of anti-sociability. And actually, probably I think that certainly I would, if I was one of the people in this inquiry, want to ask, did you really think about what this was going to do to a nation's psychology, emotion, sociability? Finances, all the rest of it.
Well, that does need to be looked at. Well, then, of course, you've got to balance it out and say, well, what was it the least worst option? Because that's what we just don't know.
And that's the lesson we should be learning.
And that's something the inquiry doesn't seem to want to address. It has taken it as read.
Do you get the feeling as well that they're asking questions that are just sort of about feeding the press the next day's headline?
That's what I said about Blockbuster.
Yeah.
It's like there's I think you have all these kind of punchy lawyers looking for their moment as well. I don't want to be too cynical, but there is this sort of feeling of we're gonna get Boris Johnson.
Yes.
There's lots of people in the country that want to get Boris Johnson, but it's not appropriate in a sort of process like this that is meant to be cold, considered, and come up with sort of facts to plan future policies.
Yeah. Ella, let's have a look at something totally different, should we? And this is professional Santas, the ones who help Father Christmas when he can't get everywhere at Christmas.
Yes, St Nick Subs. It's from a sort of review of business insurance policies, but looked at what sort of situation companies were at and found that there was a severe lack of professional Santas, and that there are... It's just very funny because it obviously is a very serious job, and just getting your dad to put on a suit and pretend to be Santa doesn't work for everyone. But they have Steve Townsend, who's a professional Santa, quoted as saying, it's a really big problem. I'm booked up and I'm having to travel greater distances, which means mounting petrol bills. But surely the sleigh gets
but only the actual
real
Father
one.
Christmas gets the sleigh.
But I think the reason I picked this out was because, there's less professional Santas. But I actually think now that, because I'm gearing up for the Christmas season with a 1-year-old and talking to people about, the stay-in-place and groups I go to about Christmas parties, and it just isn't the same now because there's such a sort of... I remember my dad going in and getting dressed up and everyone bringing food and it being a much more informal place. I think now Christmas parties, particularly for kids, are so swamped in health. I don't want to be that person that nags on health and safety, but health and safety or rules. I can't bring stuff into the nursery because you don't know. Someone said to me, well, you don't know what the hygiene is like in people's homes. And you think, oh, dear. It's that sort of sense of people coming together informally and throwing everything together is gone.
You can't take your toddler swimming anymore because you can't take photographs of them taking their first,
Can't you?
You're not allowed cameras, not with children.
Do you think it's got worse since COVID as well? Do you know that people are a bit more...
Yeah.
Especially talking about hygiene, that's made me think that people are wary of interacting.
I don't want to rush you, but this is a story Anne is desperate to talk about, Fraser. It's true.
It's a fascinating
true.
story.
This is in the Mail about Viagra.
Yeah, so there's going to be a new BBC drama about the origins of Viagra called Man Up. But the story is absolutely fascinating. It came about completely by accident. It was an unintended side effect of a drug that they wanted to treat angina with it. It turned out the nurse asked all these men, they're all coal miners in Merthyr Tydfil, and only one of them was brave enough to admit when they were asked...
They were all doing the trial.
They're all doing this... Sorry, they're all doing this clinical trial, but only one of the men was brave enough to admit what one of the side effects was. The famous getting you ready, performance ready, I guess you could say. And... everyone...
Dramatically so, apparently.
Dramatically so.
And he was the only one who had the courage to...
He was the only one. But
tell the nurse.
Once he admitted it to the nurse, then the other men said, oh, yes, I've had the same thing. And that's where this was born. And it's fascinating, all the other things that people have tried in order to mimic the experience of Viagra in history. People have tried to use... crocodile parts, rubbing them on their downstairs back in ancient Egypt. The ancient Greeks used spicy peppers.
Spicy peppers?
Russians used to believe that you could they'd hoped that you could transplant monkey testicles into our own. They didn't actually try this out, but they believed that might work.
I'm glad
so thankfully we have the... Exactly,
instead.
so thankfully we have the blue pill, and it's
and
one
the
of the most...
drama is written by Russell T Davies.
Yes.
The Doctor Who writer.
The Doctor Who writer, and I can't remember what's the name of the AIDS drama he did recently.
Well, he's been in some controversy recently because of his mangling of Doctor Who. But if there was ever someone who was...
No. Look, the man is a genius when it comes to...
If there was ever going to be someone who could do one like this, it would be Russell T Davies. And people laugh at Viagra and all the rest of it and make it sound, it has a bad rap. There's actually... people sort of think it's... there's still a sort of stigma around it. I think it was quite...
nudge, wink, wink.
Yeah, but actually it's, relationships and love and all the rest of it is a huge part of people's lives. And
at the end of
facilitating
this trial,
that, especially when you're older, is a wonderful thing.
At the end of this clinical trial, the doctors said to all of the men on the trial, now you've done the trial, you've got to give the drug back, please. And they refused.
Yeah, no one would. And it's quite moving, actually. One of them saying this was the first time, it actually really repaired relationships with his wife. So, we can laugh at it. It seems trivial, but it's really important, and it's one of the most prescribed drugs of all time, and there's good reason for that.
Well, there you go. On that note, we'll leave it there.
I told you it'd be eye-popping. It's a great story.
Eye-popping. Eye-popping.
Here's the weather.